Ladies and gentlemen, good day. Malaysia and India have long had close connections and relations, whether in terms of politics, economy, social interactions, cultural connections, many different connections that we've had over the years. Historically, from the pre-modern era, we have been inextricably bonded through the expansions of the kingdoms of Indian monarchs in the Southeast Asian region, and through trade, where Indian traders forged new pathways to establish trade in this region. It cannot be denied that the connections between Malaysia and Indian civilization have been based in historical and cultural significance. The Malaysian Indian diaspora is a great example of this particular connection. Nowhere is the Indian influence more evident than in the languages that we speak in Malaysia, especially in the Malay language. The Indian influence is evident in the referential terms that we use to refer to our food, our customs, our rituals, our cultural artifacts, our theological references, as well as buildings and edifices that are here in Malaysia, among many other different domains. Ladies and gentlemen, the topic of today's talk is the Indian influence on the Malay language. And in my opinion, the speaker of today's talk is the most suitable person to speak about this matter. Professor Emeritus Asma Haji Omar has had great research in this particular area. Professor Asma is an eminent scholar in the field of languages and linguistics. She has researched extensively into the field of linguistics, advancing the field, especially Malay linguistics. She has documented the language and its dialects extensively, as well as other indigenous languages in Malaysia, even to the extent of spending weeks in the wilderness and remote areas of Malaysia, conducting her fieldwork on 28 languages in Sabah and Sarawak. Professor Asma obtained her PhD from the University of London in 1969, at a time where very few women were actually pursuing their advanced studies. This was in fact a milestone for Malaysian women. She was one of the first women, Malay women in Malaysia, to obtain her PhD. Professor Asma has been a visiting scholar and professor at many different academic institutions across the world and has achieved numerous eminent awards for her research in linguistics. She was in fact the founder of the Faculty of Languages and Linguistics and served as the dean of the faculty for many years. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would like to pass the floor on to Professor Asma Haji Omar to tell you a little bit about the Indian influence on the Malay language. Professor Asma, the floor is all yours.
Hello everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the Indian High Commission in Kuala Lumpur for inviting me to give this talk today in the occasion of the celebration of the 75th anniversary of the Indian independence from the British rule. And I would like to thank Mr. Prabhakar Nair for being the person who had contacted me for this occasion. And I would also like to thank Dr. Surin Depau, Dean of the Faculty of Languages and Linguistics, University of Malaya, for having made this recording available. And of course to her staff who had been very diligently working on making this recording program a success. Thank you very much. My talk today is on Indian influence on the Malay language. Now, when it is said that a language X has an influence on another language, which is Y, it means that it has contributed to the development of Y in the form of the enrichment of some aspect of the system or structure of Y or of both. In simple terms, Y borrows elements of language X, or looking the other way around, X loans its linguistic elements to Y, a case of borrowing or loaning where no repayment is required. In the topic of this talk, which is India's influence on the Malay language, X, which is the source or donor of the loan elements, represents languages from India, while Y, the borrower or the beneficiary, is the Malay language. Generally speaking, borrowing by one language from another is born out of necessity. That is to say, speakers of the borrower Y have come across a new concept or a new item of culture that is new to their community, and there is no word in their language to label that concept or item. Rather than wasting time coining a new word from elements of their own language, the result of which may not match the concept or item concerned, they have a better way of solving their problem. This better way is to transfer the word from the source language with or without any adaptation in its sound or pronunciation. The borrowing or loaning process of linguistic elements is a feature of language context everywhere in the world and has become an interesting field of study for those involved in social linguistics as well as historical linguistics. Malay has undergone the so-called influence from other languages from every direction of the wind, to quote a Malay idiom. Besides the influence from India, there are two other most significant influences on Malay, and these are those of Arabic and English. It may be said that the languages from India, the Arab world, and England have enriched the Malay language most significantly, particularly in terms of vocabulary or the lexicon, in tandem with the socio-cultural development undergone in the Malay-speaking world through different periods in the history of their civilization. In recorded history, Indian influence in the Malay world is said to be during the time of the Srivijaya Empire, from the 7th to the 14th century of the Common Era. The 4 stone inscriptions of the 7th century, generally known as the Srivijaya inscriptions, were discovered in South Sumatra and the Bangka Island, which were part of the Srivijaya Empire. The empire included the Malay Peninsula, where Kedah, then known as Langkasuka, was an important headquarters in this vast kingdom. The inscriptions, whose texts are in Malay of that time, seem to be the only ones written in the Malay language with narratives of the 17th century rule of Srivijaya in the Malay world. They represent the first ever written form of the Malay language, inscribed in the Pallava script of South India. This is concrete proof of the influence of Indian civilization in the Malay world. Sanskrit words are present in the language of those texts, specifically for concepts of kingship and kingdom that had no Malay words to signify them. The Indians could have come to the Malay world with a prime interest to spread their religions of Hinduism and Buddhism, as well as their culture. But they did not establish a community of their own people in the peninsula or any other place in the Malay world. If they had stayed on and did not return to India after their mission was fulfilled, they could be absorbed into the Malay society. The 4 Malay inscriptions of Srivijaya kingdom have been given labels based on where they were found. The Kedukan Bukit in Palembang, 682 CE, Talang Tuo in Palembang, 684 CE, Karang Brahi in Jambi, 686 CE, and Kota Kapur in Bangka Island, 688 CE. The texts are about the journey of the ruling king to parts of the kingdom. The dates given in the Common Era were calculated by experts based on those written on the inscriptions according to the Shaka calendar, giving 2 years apart from one place to the other. The spread of Hinduism and Buddhism in the islands of the Malay archipelago, mainly Java, Sumatra, and the Malay Peninsula, varied in terms of degree of influence. When the Pallava script was used in the writing of the Malay language in these 4 inscriptions in Sumatra and the Bangka Island, it did not journey to the Malay Peninsula. In other words, the script was not spread to the Malay-speaking people in the Malay Peninsula and likewise to the common people in Sumatra. But it was adopted in the writing of Javanese, that is to say, the Javanese script, the Hono Choro Ko, is an adaptation of the Pallava script. This being the case, stories from Indian epics of Ramayana and Mahabharata, as well as the Jataka tales that Malays came to know, were handed down orally. During the ancient period of time, various Malay groups had already had their own writing systems, which were in the form of hieroglyphics, and as such were limited in usage to the language of the rituals. The coming of Islam spurred the Malays to adapt the Arabic writing to suit the sound system of their language, and this adapted system is now known as the Jawi writing. Having Jawi writing was a boost to their intellectual life, as they were able to put their treasury of oral traditions and their traditional laws into writing. And the written corpus included stories from Indian epics as well as other tales. It was through the written forms of such stories that Sanskrit loans from India could find a permanent passage into the Malay language. And the Sanskrit loans have resided in those texts even to this day. And these words get used and reused in literary works produced to this very day. Words taken from Sanskrit belong to many domains or categories of use. Concepts used in the Hindu and Buddhist belief systems still live on in the stories derived from the Indian epics and folk tales. Some of these words remain in Malay everyday usage, even in narratives which have their sources in Islam, as they are not in opposition to the teaching of Islam. Among these words are Shurga for heaven, Neraka for hell, Dosa for sin, Derhaka for to betray, Pahala for reward from the Almighty for a good deed. In this brief talk, it is not possible for me to list out the Sanskrit loans in Malay. So I will mention only the major domains the loans belong to. These are, beside those in the belief systems, are domains of governance, community and the family, education and the intellect, language, literature, culture, emotion and attitude, cosmology, and various aspects of material culture. Another wave of linguistic influence from India arrived at the end of the 19th century, about 12 centuries after the first group of arrivals, and 5 centuries after the fall of Srivijaya. This does not mean that there was no connectivity at all between India and the Malay world in the intervening centuries. Malay hikayat, or historical romances, include protagonists from India in their storylines. And the Sejarah Melayu, the Malay annals, describes the role played by Indians in the courts of the Malacca Sultanates. From the linguistic point of view, while these protagonists had a role to play in the Malay community, they did not leave a new impact on the development of Malay. One can say that the linguistic impact of the time of Srivijaya continued to exist and became absorbed into the Malay language over the centuries. The second wave of linguistic influence from India, that is from the end of the 19th century, originates from South Indian languages of the Dravidic family. A totally different family from Sanskrit, which is Indo-Aryan. Unlike the early visitors from India, who did not live communities of their people in the Malay world, the second wave of arrivals have formed visible communities in Malaysia, each speaking its own language brought over from India, such as Tamil, Telugu, and Malayalam. Most of them are Tamil-speaking people. As such, most of the linguistic elements from the second wave, which are transferred into the Malay language, are those from Tamil. However, in terms of quantity, Tamil loanwords in the Malay language are a fraction of those from Sanskrit. Almost all these loan items are those belonging to the material culture representing foodstuff, plants and fruits, spices and household items. In terms of the quantity of single lexical items and their domains of use, the difference between the influence of Sanskrit and that of Tamil in the Malay language may be attributed to the circumstances of the context, as mentioned earlier, the processes and the factors behind each of those contexts. The first wave of Indian influence took place when the Indians came as educators, introducing to the Malays new belief systems and a new way in organizing their community. With new fields of knowledge came abstract and intellectualized concepts, which were new to the Malays. The second wave of linguistic influence arrived at a stage of Malay civilization, which was already well established in their religious belief, the organization of their own community into sultanates, and the advancement in their social, cultural, and intellectual life. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Emeritus Datuk Asma Haji Omar, for the enlightening talk on India's influence on the Malay language, and to the Faculty of Languages and Linguistics, University of Malaya, for assisting with the program, which is useful indeed in pointing us to the historiographic drifts in regards to the subject. Having recognized significant gaps in our understanding of the dynamics of early Indian influences in the region, it is our hope that scholars from both Malaysia and India will join hands in bridging existing gaps in the documentation of our common past. This is a task to which both countries could commit themselves in the run-up to the 65th Malayan independence and the 75th anniversary of Indian independence, which will be commemorated in August of 2022. Thank you.